Right, so good afternoon, everybody, or good morning for those who are calling in from Europe to listen to this. This is the first inter-chamber webinar across the ASEAN region. We are delighted today to have with us the executive directors from 8 of the EUROCHAMs across the region. We have with us today, and I'm doing this in order, alphabetical order of countries. We have Blaise, who's the ED from EUROCHAM Cambodia, Edison, who's the executive director at EUROCHAM Indonesia, Ayaka, who is the executive director at ECCIL in Laos. We have Sven from EUMCCI in Malaysia. We have Mark from EuroCham in Myanmar, Florian from ECCP for the Philippines, Naila from EuroCham Singapore, and Kuncharanya from EABC in Thailand. Welcome to all of you. Thank you for joining this. Today we're going to have a canter around the region on the COVID-19 situation across Southeast Asia. My colleagues in the various chambers will be giving us a briefing on where things currently stand in their own particular markets, measures that governments have brought in terms of lockdowns and attempts to contain the virus, and then on economic stimulus issues, and hopefully a viewpoint on how European industry is seeing those markets performing. Bit of housekeeping, all your attendees, you're all muted and your cameras are off. If you wish to ask questions, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens. I will try to get through those questions. My colleagues in the chambers will be presenting for 5 to 6 minutes each. I'll be asking them some questions after each one, but there will be time at the end for some general Q&A. And I think that's about it. And we will be kicking off with Cambodia and Blaise. So Blaise, I think over to you, if you can share your screen and your slides. Thank you. And unmute yourself, please, Blaise.
Here I am. Thank you very much, Chris, and UABC for inviting us to this very interesting seminar. So I'm going to share my screen, and as we have little time, I will go straight to the point. So the situation in Cambodia, if we look at the health situation, actually we have been, I would say, very preserved. Only 126 cases so far, no casualty. It is credible, mind you. The tests are being run by the Cambodian government with the Pasteur Institute, which is independent. We have a number of reasons for this, which can probably be related to low density in the country, and to no public transport, a young population. But I'm not a doctor, so I'm not going to elaborate on this. The fact is that we have been quite preserved. Hospitals are not overwhelmed. The Cambodian authorities have acted swiftly, especially at the beginning when they started to close the schools immediately after the first cases. That being said, we have not had a strict confinement or lockdown, except during the Cambodian New Year, where you have traditionally mass traveling of population. These were the only days where the government restricted the movement from province to province. But overall, crowded places like cinemas, KTVs, clubs, or gyms have been closed, but not much more than this. It has more been about individual precaution as advised by the government, by the WHO, and by Pasteur. But of course, besides this, Cambodia has, like every other country, been somehow disconnected from the rest of the world through their own measures and through the measures taken by their neighbors and by the other economies connected to the country. So although the health situation is good, the economy has been heavily impacted. Cambodia is an economy which relies, of course, a lot on its integration to the rest of the world. Tourism and garment are the traditional main drivers of economic growth. Tourism has been very badly hit, down to 90% in March. Now we are maybe at minus 40–50% because domestic consumption is slowly picking up. But it's tourism without international tourists, so you can imagine the situation. In terms of garment, the main markets are the EU and the USA. So at the beginning of the crisis, there was an issue of supply from China. But as the pandemic was moving throughout the world, it came down to minus 40% in orders from the USA and the EU, and in total minus 13% drop in exports between January and May, which are figures given by the Garment Manufacturers Association of Cambodia. The main issue for businesses, and I think it's probably the same everywhere, is working capital asphyxia, if I may say. Zero revenue, high fixed cost, you know, whether it's rental of your factory land or of your hotel or restaurant, or whether it's salaries, you know, whether it's loans, little reserves, because in the countries that has been booming for the past 20 years, people were constantly reinvesting their revenues. So the problem is that the businesses do not have cash flow and they don't know how long the crisis is going to last. So there is no visibility, no working capital, and as time passes by, there is a risk of more and more collapse of the So the current forecast for the recession, because it will be a recession this year, is between -2% and -3% for 2020. It changes every day, so it may evolve, you know. The World Bank is talking about a rebound in 2021 to 6%, but it remains to be seen because, again, forecasts are being updated almost every 2 weeks. The social impact is also heavy. Job losses, around 200,000 plus about 80,000 migrant workers who came back from Thailand who have no job. So these people have lost their job, have lost their salaries, you know, and it may be even slightly underestimated because Cambodia is an economy that still is partly informal. And so these are the accounts that we have from the formal businesses, those who are registered and who can therefore declare that they have suspended workers, laid off workers, you know, or cut salaries. So there is a fear of a social impact which cannot yet be fully evaluated. But when you talk about 200,000 to 300,000 people, you can multiply by 5 in terms of people who actually depend on them. They send money to their household, you know, they have loans with microfinance, they have credit. So we cannot evaluate this yet, but it's part of the fear for what would come next. The government has taken a series of measures, so to be honest, they have been also very open to dialogue with the private sector. I would only raise a few. There have been more than 100 decisions made over the past months. The most important, I would say, is the survival allowance that they have been giving to workers who have been suspended, provided those workers were declared to the Ministry of Labour, and therefore provided the business can declare that they are suspending them, which puts a limitation on it. The disbursement have started. It was a bit slow, but now it's happening. Fiscal exemptions, electricity discounts, but it works only if you have an activity. If not, it doesn't help much, to be honest. Very daring decisions regarding working capital, government-backed loans and credit facility, but we have to see how it's going to be implemented. It's been announced, but we have not seen the actual details yet. Support to SME, I will talk about it later. The main issue remains with banks and landlords, where the government is not willing to intervene in the market mechanism. Therefore, they have only been giving guidelines and somehow advice and some small incentives to banks to restructure loans and to landlords to be more flexible. But this issue of loans and rental is part of the high fixed costs that are creating the working capital asphyxia or lack of working capital for the businesses. So it is a real problem. SME support, the government now is trying to target local SMEs to boost them in a context where, you know, the rest of the investment are faced with difficulties. All of these measures are very interesting, but somehow they are coming from a good initiative, but they are faced with the usual issue of every decision in Cambodia, which is related to efficiency, you know, diligent implementation, and also good coordination between the main government stakeholder. So that takes me to what is needed for the future. Cambodia had already well identified that they had to diversify their industrial production, that they had to create more value, and I think the current crisis is making this need even more pressing. An industrial development policy was adopted in 2015, but the results are yet to be fully seen, and therefore I think the current crisis somehow highlights the need to press with this, and I believe the government is aware of it, but also there is this big SME landscape that is not up to standard, that has little access to finance, that is not connected to the FDI, and I think that part of the vision of the government for what comes next is really to strengthen this SME landscape, to build capacity, to make access to finance more easy to those SMEs, The government has taken many decisions to create a skills development fund, an SME bank, what they call Khmer Enterprise, which is designed to support entrepreneurs. And so they really want to focus on this, which I think is a way to create new drivers for the economic growth, which are more domestic based, and which can be ultimately connected to FDI or even replace, foreign induced production in the future. And the last one I would say is reducing dependence on major external partners. Cambodia is very dependent on EU and the USA for their export market, and they are very dependent on China for FDI. And the current crisis plus EBA plus a possible slowdown in China means that it is very important for them to diversify all kinds of partners as much as possible. And we think that they are trying to do it. But here again, the main issue is how efficient the enforcement of decision can be, how coordinated the implementation of measures can be between all the government stakeholders. So this is, however, what would be the next step, I would say. An overview. I'm trying to go fast because Chris told us to really stick to the time, so I hope it's happening. Overview to summarize: health impact, we have been preserved, definitely. I think we are quite lucky as compared to many other countries. Economic and social impact, heavy and not yet fully, I think, evaluated. It's possible that more will come. It will depend on how long businesses can hold on without working capital, or when they can start to reconstitute their working capital, or how. And finally, I think all of this shows that it's time to accelerate the transformation of the Cambodian growth model, which was really based on cheap labor-intensive production, based on FDI with little domestic linkages for so long. And now the challenge is to accelerate this transformation. It had been identified, it had been decided, but it needs to happen now. So that's my short and quickly told presentation, Chris, and thank you very much. I will be waiting for questions later on, I guess.
Thanks, Blaise. Actually, I've got a few quick questions for you immediately to follow up on that. So perhaps you can just give us a bit more of a flavour of the level of consultation between the government and the private sector there. In particular, is the government addressing the needs of the private sector in Cambodia? And if not, what more could they be doing?
So, to be honest, there have been a lot of consultations, and we have taken a leading part in this at EUROCHAM Cambodia. I think that, again, the government has been listening to many of the requests. They have been taking decisions which reflect the needs of the private sector. The only thing is how, again, efficiently they are going to be able to implement these decisions. That's one point. The second point, I think, is more sensitive. It's related again to loans restructuring, loans flexibility from policy from the bank and the landlords, because we have this issue of working capital, of lack of working capital, and the government, I think, has made a point, not only now but for many years already, not to intervene too much in the market mechanism. However, I can testify that the level of dialogue has been very high. And what is left now is really usual issues for Cambodia, which are again enforcement and coordination among all government partners. These are normal, usual issues here, but in a time where we are talking about emergency measures, it takes a whole new dimension.
Okay, thank you. You mentioned in your presentation as well about the huge impact on the tourist industry. Of course, lockdowns on borders, restrictions on travel don't help with that, and it could be some time before it comes back. And indeed, it inhibits opening up to other markets as well for just general economic activity. So I think there's one question on the Q&A, which is about a decision to ensure that foreigners have a COVID-19 test on arrival and pay a significant deposit of $3,000 for any potential treatment. How is that going to impact on opening up? Do you think that's going to continue? And in general, does Cambodia have the wherewithal to help it diversify its trading base?
Thanks. So yeah, it's 3,000 and not 3 million, indeed. I mean, obviously, I think Cambodia, like any other country, they are faced with this very difficult choice between, preserving the health of the population or restarting the economy. So this decision obviously is a sign that for the moment they prefer to focus on preserving, on preserving the health and trying to keep this little miracle that happened where we have so few cases and no casualty and no overwhelmed hospital facility. That being said, yes, it's not going to help tourism. It's not going to help, the economy to restart. So I think it's a policy choice that they have made. It's going to be very difficult for a sector which is already heavily impacted, where you have a lot of job losses. I would tend to think, that possibly they are expecting to open first and foremost probably to China again. China was the first to be sick. They are the first to recover. The links that they have to Cambodia. So maybe they are trying to bank on a future, a bridge with China for additional tourism flows. Yes, I mean, this measure is not going to help on the short time from the business side. Now they have made a decision, I think, to protect the health of the people. I mean, we can be for or against it, but I guess this is a choice that has been discussed in all countries around the world, right?
Okay, and the final one, which is probably the more politically charged one. The removal of everything but arms by the EU on Cambodia. How has that exacerbated the problems that have come along with COVID-19? Well,
I mean, the position of EuroCham Cambodia, right? We have always been against the removal of EBA. We think it's counterproductive. We think it's not helping the relationship between the EU and Cambodia. We think it doesn't help to capitalize on progress that were made before, socially and economically. So, of course, in a context where everything is somehow collapsing, especially in the garment industry, it's making, again, I believe, the people's life even worse because of a principle that we are putting forward. So you have people who are losing their jobs, who have salary cuts. The market is collapsing, and this is, this EBA removal is not going to help any recovery. It's not going to have the situation now, so it's going to have probably an impact. Maybe even an impact for the recovery, because if some companies decide to close, will they come back to Cambodia to do garment? And we go back to what I was saying about, diversifying and creating more added value. So I don't think it's going to help in any way. I don't think it's going to also help to maybe to remand the ties between the two countries, if I may say. So yes, it's definitely not going to help. And the private sector, the Garment Manufacturer Association, EuroCham, and other association, we wrote together to Brussels to ask them at least to consider postponing this decision. But so far, we don't see any decision to do so. We are funded by the EU. We are grateful for that. Again and again on this specific topic.
Thanks, Blaise. We'll come back, I'm sure, with some more questions. But we'll turn now to Edison in Jakarta with EuroCham Indonesia. If Edison can share his screen with us.
Okay. Right. Okay. Okay. I'll give you a brief update as to the impact of the COVID-19 situation on Indonesia. Okay. Basically, I will touch on these points. I'll go straight to the subject matter. This is where Indonesia is as of the current time. We have 34,316 positive cases as of yesterday. 1,959 deaths, and the recovery rate is there as shown. As you can see, we have the largest population within the ASEAN region, and also we've, as a result, we've also had a substantial impact, a deadly impact from the coronavirus. We are going through a gradual process of a new normal or return to normalcy in terms of work. Some countries that have done that do so when the total cases and new cases have receded, but in this case, total cases and new cases continues to be on the rise in Indonesia. So in this case, to look back at the situation, what steps did the government take to mitigate the spread of the coronavirus pandemic? It all came about in March, and to mitigate such impact, the government temporarily imposed a ban on the exports of antiseptics, raw materials, and masks, which are important for the hospitals and healthcare workers to protect themselves in case of a mass pandemic. This is followed up by the end of March with a exemption of import licenses for medical devices, as well as a temporary ban for entry of foreigners to Indonesia at the time. And then eventually in April, the government gave the green light to impose a lockdown on a regional basis, which is a large-scale social restriction, or PSBB, that was implemented in Jakarta on 10th April, followed by the surrounding areas of Bogor, Depok, Bekasi on 15th of April, and Tangerang on the 18th. This was a critical time during this juncture because April was the fasting month, Indonesia being the largest Muslim country within the Southeast Asian region. This is also a key factor as well. Because of the lockdown, there was a lot of businesses that stopped operations. And as a result, there was also a high unemployment rate as well as a result. So a lot of the people that originated from the provinces decided to go back. Hence, there was a potential increase for the spread of the pandemic or the virus at the time. So what the government did is in 23 April, it imposed a ban on the sort of like the homecoming visits or mudik to the provinces in preparation for the Eid celebrations at the time. And most recently, as of last week, the Jakarta governor began easing restrictions on the lockdown. So we're now in sort of the transition phase to the new normal. Most offices are working on a 50% maximum of 50% capacity as of the time being. So what sort of policy responses has the government taken? The government has outlined a COVID-19 mitigation budget of around 405 trillion as of May, which is roughly around 28.6 billion, and has since increased that to 641.17 early in June, and eventually 670 trillion most recently in this month as well. So this includes social safety net of 110 trillion, as well as support for the industries and those affected by the pandemic. So what does the economic stimulus package or the National Economic Recovery Program comprise? As you can see in the slide, a lot of it is allocated for the support for consumption, as well as for fiscal incentives and the acceleration of compensation payments. So to wrap things up, my 5 minutes is coming up. What has the impact on the COVID-19 situation have on Indonesia? Well, it has impacted a lot of the local and global supply chain. And as the market is downsized and has implemented border restrictions as well. Definitely global and national economy are expected to experience a slowdown. This is also followed by high unemployment. The Ministry of Manpower is currently projecting, that amount of around 2 million, but the Indonesian Chambers of Commerce expects the actual amount to be a lot higher at 15 million. So a lot of the efforts now is to address that issue. Hence, that's why we're now back into the new normal phase. Business needs to be restored, and also confidence also needs to be restored in order for the economic recovery to kick in. The IMF has lowered Indonesia's growth rates, growth projections to 0.5%. And the Ministry of Finance has also downgraded also their initial projection for the full year as well. That basically tells you how disastrous an impact that the COVID-19 situation has to a country of such scale within the Southeast Asian region. EuroCham is a firm supporter of increased ties between EU and Indonesia. And one of these efforts is through the EU-Indonesia CEPA round of negotiations. We were hoping that this would kick off in March of 2020, but unfortunately, because of the COVID situation, this was put on hold. And EuroCham Indonesia, along with the Indonesian Chambers of Commerce, Kadin, took the bold step of writing the chief negotiators from Indonesia and the EU to help kickstart this, because we believe this agreement will help accelerate the recovery process for both Indonesia and also for Europe as well, as we both have something that is a mutual benefit for both countries in terms of increased trade and ties. So the last question is, how fast will the recovery take? Well, it depends on how fast the COVID situation is put under control. So at this point of time, it all depends on each and every Indonesians and as to how they practice the safe levels of the new normal in terms of the hand washing, wearing of masks, social distancing, of that nature. But while at the same time keeping a semblance of normalcy by working and striving to form a sense of recovery and semblance normalcy in this country. So that basically ends my 5 minutes presentation, Chris.
Thanks, Edison. A very quick question for you. It's one that came from the Q&A, one I was going to ask anyway. Is how real are the numbers in Indonesia? I mean, there's a lot of skepticism around the region that the numbers in Indonesia are underreported and that there's not sufficient testing going on.
That in itself is true in terms of the testing initially, but I think a lot of it is we have to trust the government's numbers. There are no other valid or credible sources for that. But given whether the numbers are credible or not, the fact remains that we still have the highest positive cases and death rates within the region. So we have to use that as a barometer as to how we should move forward. That's how I could explain it, Chris.
I think you're vying with Singapore for #1 spot in number of cases, but that's a different issue. And in terms of opening up, it's, from the outside at least, it seems that Indonesia is moving to open up perhaps faster than other countries might in a similar situation in terms of your number of cases. How much of that is being driven by popular sentiment on the ground from individuals, the desire to get back to work and earn some money?
I think it's the sentiment or the drive comes from combination of both businesses and the government, and also the need to generate employment as well. 3 months is a very long time, Chris, and it's had a disastrous impact on Indonesia as a whole. For example, the Purchasing Managers Index as of May went up slightly compared to April. It was at 28.6 points, but that itself is still way below the 50-point benchmark that is symbolic of growth in the country. So we're still a long way off. On top of that, this is the summer school month. It's best to start now when everybody's at home. So that basically is another trigger point as to why we should start to roll out the new normal at this point of time. And the number of cases or of infections, the large number of cases, as trends see, is mostly in the large cities of Indonesia and Surabaya, or rather Jakarta and Surabaya, as of this point of time. So it's pretty much basically put on hold in these areas as of the time being. So hopefully, we have to trust the government. We have to support the government, and also work hard to help on the economic recovery, so to speak.
So in terms of economic recovery, do you think that this situation could be a spur for further economic reforms in Indonesia? Perhaps removal of negative investment lists?
I think it's not only in Indonesia, but also in all countries that are affected by the COVID-19. This is a great time to sit down and talk on an equal basis. So I think I see a lot of hope in this, and I hope this will generate in productive outcomes for both EU and Indonesia. I understand the EU-Indonesia SIPA round of negotiations are expected to roll back again, so maybe sometime in August or June. So hopefully we can see something productive that comes out of it real soon.
Thanks, Edison. We'll come back in a bit with some more questions for you, but now we'll move to the north up to VNTN and to IACA at ECCIL, if you could please.
Good afternoon. Talking about Laos, we have a look at the current situation. We had 19 infections for a total testing volume today, as of yesterday, of a bit less than 10,000 people. And we are very happy to say that we have now 0 active case, as the latest patient was discharged from the hospital 2 days ago. About the lockdown and restriction, we have been entered in a lockdown situation de facto because especially Vietnam and Thailand has closed the border, but we have Laos has came into domestic lockdown from the 30th of March. That was initially planned for 3 weeks, and after the latest case, which was declared on the 12th, the government decided to extend for a period of 14 days the lockdown. So since the 3rd of May, we are going back to new normal, with which has been done in a gradual way. So we have now the domestic flight will have resumed. The meetings and trainings are also allowed now. Also, the restaurants and everything and the hotel were closed. The restaurants were open only for takeout, so now they are also allowed to reopen for dining. But still, all the borders are still closed. And so, yes, about now the measure from the government. So the government has agreed on the economic stimulus packages. So it will be more about tax exemption. And the last one that's is kind of the more impactful will be the credit program that has been agreed by the Bank of the Lao PDR. So this one will allow for the companies who have been affected by COVID-19 to benefit from this special loan condition. And in terms of impact, so for Laos, the most impacted was, of course, tourism. We are now expecting to resume as soon as possible. So first with the domestic customers, but as well, Vietnam Airlines has announced that they will be flying again soon with Laos as soon as the border will open. So we do hope that it can boost also and generate a bit of flow of people. So so that was for the post-pandemic plans. If I have to make an overview of the situation and how the situation was managed by the government, the testing volume is pretty low, but I believe that the fact that the government of Laos has also taken all the preventive measures pretty early, even before the first case was declared, has helped a lot. The lockdown, also the extension of the lockdown, was pretty smart, and with the new normal now, we are still implementing measures such as the check temperature, the wearing mask, and all the social distancing required. So that's it for my side.
Thank you. You got very, very low numbers there in Laos, and that I think is attributed mainly to the fact that you acted quite swiftly from the first case to go into lockdown, and borders being closed by Vietnam and Thailand as well. When do you see those borders perhaps reopening to allow for transport of goods and indeed international flights for tourists and business travelers to return?
It was initially planned for July, but actually, so the main countries where we come from the two Laos would be Thailand and Vietnam. So Thailand has postponed the flights to August, the earliest, and Vietnam, as Laos is considered as a low-risk country, should also be reoperating again from August. Okay,
and then in terms of economic stimulus packages, I guess the scope for the Lao government is not as great as some others, given that it's not perhaps the richest of the ones in the region. So how much more scope have they got to try and pump more money into the country, and particularly to help things like the tourism industry?
So we see it again, Chris?
Yeah, sorry. So the scope for the government in Laos to provide more economic stimulus packages to help industry in the country is probably quite limited, given their own funds. But what more do you think they could do to help industries, particularly tourism?
We know that after some discussion with the private sector, so they would like us to, they would like the government and the chambers to help on, working on plans for first as a first phase as a domestic traveling, and also in the future to advertise as like Laos as a safe country. So from our side, we have also been working on with the tourism sector with our members and we send some recommendation to the ministries. So for now, the first phase was about to have all this kind of exemption about the tax and everything. But I believe that the main direction would be to communicate and advertise Laos as a safe destination.
Okay. One quick question from someone in the audience. Is Laos still requiring quarantine for foreign arrivals into the country?
Yes, we do. So for now, we have they have opened the borders for charter flights only. So people have to be quarantined in certain hotels that have been selected in coordination with the ministries.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll come back to some more question links shortly. But right now, we're going to fly right over to KL and to Sven at EU-MCCI. Interesting times in Malaysia at the moment in terms of politics, but what's going on with COVID-19, Sven?
Okay, let us have a look into that. Let me share my screen. Thank you, Chris. All right, here we go. Okay, I hope everybody can see that. You're right, politically we have an interesting time. I hope we don't see more turmoil, but when we're looking at COVID-19, and I try to fly through this quickly because I think quite a few slides here. We were actually doing not too bad. The government reacted relatively quickly, end of February, beginning of March. We had a lockdown, they call it here MCO as well. I will talk a bit more about it, but if you just look at the naked numbers, so to speak, it looks quite okay. We have 8,300 cases. There might be a few more, but it is very limited. I just had this week the chance to also speak to our Director General of Health quite quickly, and he was mentioning that the transmissions at the moment really refer mainly to foreign workers. I think Singapore knows the problem very well, so we are facing that, but we're talking about 6 to 7 infections, so that's really limited, and probably also the reason why we have moved on into a lighter form of the lockdown. And let me show what that means basically. We started off in March with something we called movement control order. That was very restrictive. We had only essential sectors working. Essential sectors mainly were things like healthcare, any kind of medical devices and pharmaceuticals manufacturers, food and beverage manufacturers, and related. We had a lot of problems during that phase. I think everybody had probably the same problems. We had a restrictive approval system which came in, which was supposed to assist, but since the understanding of complex supply chains is quite a difficult task, even for experts, I think. The government felt that they didn't really see, for example, when you talk about packaging for, say, sanitizers or something, nobody really thought about that we need to have manufacturers for packaging also being active on that side. So as you can imagine, that caused quite some trouble in the beginning, but we worked through it. We worked through it together with the local associations, together with the government. Ministry of International Trade and industry was very helpful in that context. And throughout April, things moved into a better place, so to speak. We also, due to the lockdown, got the numbers down. Accordingly, in beginning of May, we were able actually to come up with something which was a negative list. So meaning we actually saw from an approval system where you probably would have get hundreds of thousands of companies applying, just a couple of companies, organizations or industries not being able to operate at all. So that was much easier to manage. And with 10th June, basically, which is very recent, as you can see, we have moved into what we call RMCO. So the C stands for conditional, the R for recovery. So we're basically in a recovery phase because the infection numbers have come down so much. And again, there was a lift.
Sven, I'm sorry, I don't think your slides are moving, Sven. If you can just move down through them.
Sorry?
Your slides don't seem to be moving on the screen.
Oh yeah, that was just one slide.
All right, okay.
So we are now moving on to the next one. Thank you. Yeah, I'm hoping you see MCO, CMCO, RMCO.
No,
you're right.
We're just seeing your title slide at the moment. I think you need to go to presentation mode.
Okay, I'm not sure why that is. All right, that's weird.
If not, we can just talk. That's better. They're moving now.
Okay, I just continue talking. I'm so sorry about it. I'm not quite sure why it's happening. I'm on screen sharing and it says I'm sharing with you the slides. So let's just move into what the government has done for businesses. So you just have to listen to my beautiful voice instead of looking at it. We had a first package already in late February. The same happened in March as well. And we had a third package which came out in April. So you can see they tried in stages to bring a certain amount of money into the economy. The first one was about 20 billion ringgit, the second one 230, and the last one 10 billion. There were a number of good measures in each package. I think many countries experienced the same. We looked a lot for wage subsidy programs. We looked a lot for SME support, cash flow support. So there were a lot of good measures in each package. But certainly there were also a lot of problems with it, especially the big chunk often was with ideas like a loan moratorium. So that was not actually money which was really going back into the economy. So that certainly caused us a bit of trouble. And we're trying to work through it with the government, find better ways of how to address that and especially help SMEs to strengthen their cash flow. The problems here are mainly that even the big companies obviously will be suffering if their SME clients are not able to pay. I think it's a very simple problem and a very clear problem. Since you all cannot see the slides, I think I just skipped that issue. Now we have a fourth National Economic Recovery Plan, which just came out very recently. And again, we saw that certain continuations and certain good ideas. I think for us, it's very important to talk about how we propel business and how we make it
Sven,
more
I think you can press enable editing on top. That will allow you to go onto slide mode. The enable editing thing. If you click that, that would allow you to put on slide mode.
Let me just try this one more time.
There's an enable editing thing at the top, right? Yes. Press that. Okay. And
how's it now?
Yeah, now,
perfect.
Yeah, that's perfect.
My bad, I did not see that.
No problem.
Okay, there we go. Okay, so I was basically bringing you through these slides already. So the economic stimulus packages, as well as the fourth package, which was basically the biggest. That had the loan moratorium I talked about. So since there was about 100 billion, you can imagine that the impact was actually much less than we hoped for. And a lot of money also went into more support for the rakyat, as we say in Malaysia, the people. So considering that, obviously a lot of people are concerned. So they're putting the money back into the bank. Nothing much happened with it. So it doesn't really end up being consumed. And that certainly does not spur growth in the economy. So these are some of the challenges we're facing there. But good things are also happening. We see some more investments in the infrastructure and some more cash flow related programs through SME Bank and other organizations. So that's actually good stuff. It's obviously always bit of a balance there, and we hope that the government continues to strike that. On the one hand, helping the people, on the other hand, not forgetting that the economy needs at the moment probably a little more of assistance. I think this one I just skip in out of time. Economic outlook, let us talk a bit about that, because I think we're all concerned about that. Globally, I think we're all aware how it looks like. Everybody hopes for this nice V-shape. I'm also hoping that it's happening, but we are all not so sure about it. So if we're looking into what we can do and what European companies especially can expect there, for Malaysia, for example, we see that infrastructure investments are a good opportunity. We have a very strong construction sector, so that will be probably a component of the economy which needs to be strengthened through the infrastructure investments. On the other hand, we will have at least another 1 or 2 stimuli projects or measures, so that should actually spur further growth, especially since the first one was basically a short-term mechanism. So we're now hoping that there is something coming for mid to long term. So that's something we want to talk about probably in the future. Industries which are quite likely to benefit from it, and that is on a global scale as much as in Malaysia. We see a lot of opportunities in healthcare, medical device, and pharmaceuticals. Malaysia is very dependent in those sectors. We are not having sufficient production there, so bringing that in will be very interesting. Certainly, digital footprint has to be increased. Most companies are looking into implementation of Industry 4.0, or in many cases, to be honest, we're actually at the stage of automating it all. Yeah, so we're not even able to quickly jump into Industry 4.0 when it comes, for example, to SMEs. But we're working very heavily on this also with the government, so we see a lot of opportunities there. And certainly, sourcing is now becoming a big topic on how you set up actually a more diverse sourcing network for your supply chain. I think that makes sense considering the situation of lockdowns in one country but not in the other. So that could be very interesting and a good opportunity. Let us just skip that and come, I think, to pretty much the last slide. When we're looking at the economy itself, this is from our colleagues at Untitled Chapter, who did recently a webinar with us as well. And obviously, as you can see, we expect quite a bit of a drop in growth, or basically a recession in 2020, but they are surprisingly optimistic when it comes to 2021. I'm not sure if I'm personally sharing that optimism, and I'm also not sure if this is a bit a joke of an economist, because if you look at the numbers, 2.7, 7.2, that looks a bit odd to me, but that's how they forecasted it. So let's see if this really works out. I would be happy, because obviously it would make my job a little bit easier. And I think with that, just making some announcements for our colleagues from Bosch and B. Braun, because everybody is wondering, is there any investment taking place at all in such a phase? And yes, I'm happy to say that our colleagues in Bosch and Braun actually have been investing recently in testing facilities mainly. So that's either expansion of capacity or setting up a new one. So this is just recently came out and was announced, and very happy to see that development. They're both members, the ECCIL. So these are some of the good news at the end of the presentation. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Sven. That is indeed good news actually to end on. Otherwise, it's all very pessimistic around the region. And I think in a similar vein, what do you see as the big opportunities, particularly for European businesses in Malaysia, once we get past COVID-19 and the current loosening up in Malaysia continues?
Yeah, that's a question which we are discussing really quite heavily at the moment, because obviously some sectors, as you can imagine, are really ailing. I mean, aerospace, if you look at that, even automotive is quite challenging at the moment. We hope that they are picking up in the future. But yeah, the ones which I mentioned also earlier in the presentation, we see strong potential in healthcare. So we think that also medical devices and pharmaceuticals will be picking up quite heavily, also because the government certainly will re-strategize and look into self-sustaining sustainability in certain sectors. I believe that will also go into agriculture to some extent, and food and beverages, because obviously you don't want to be dependent all the time on importing everything. There should be a certain level. And I saw some numbers which are quite concerning, because basically the only like levels of 30 to 40% for certain basic needs, food and beverage, like rice, for example, Malaysia would be only able to cover like maybe 30%. So we feel that, for example, agri-tech could be something very interesting to work into, and to some extent probably biotechnology, because they're also trying to push this here very hard. So we won't be want to work along those lines, and we see a good potential also in view of the challenges of COVID-19, which it has posed on the supply chains and certainly cross-border transactions. So that could be something companies could be looking at.
Thanks. Been some success stories, of course, in Malaysia. Firms like Top Glove done pretty well out of this, being the world's largest maker of latex and surgical gloves. The stimulus packages they've announced in Malaysia actually have been quite significant, as you just outlined there. But given the financial problems this government and its predecessor inherited from the old UMNO-run government, how are they actually affording this?
Yeah, as I mentioned, obviously the figures sound very good, but if you think of a loan moratorium, which is about 100 billion, then you can see obviously how this is affordable, because it's not really money which comes out of the government coffers. It's just money which is basically delayed on further payment, and they just calculate that in there. Not everything is obviously some window dressing. They're really good measures. There's really money going, for example, into the wage subsidies, which we really like, and we hope that they continue that. But on the other hand, if you really talk about the big figure items, and if you have an estimate of 100 billion of your package is just a loan moratorium, you can see that the numbers are probably not all that significant for the industry sectors. Yeah, okay. So that's why they can afford it.
All right. I want to ask you one last question, which was the nasty one about the third coming of Dr. Mahathir. You can think about that one for a while. Right. Thank you, Sven. We'll move a bit further north up to Myanmar and to Mark, who is not currently in Yangon, but currently in France. But Mark, over to you.
Thank you, Chris. Okay, sharing my screen now. There you go. Thank you, Chris, for organizing this event, and thank you to all the participants. I saw a lot of messages from different countries in ASEAN as well as in Europe. So good morning and good afternoon to everyone. It is my pleasure to give you a little bit of an overview of what's going on in Myanmar. It's been quite an intense last 2 months, as in every country in the region. But I'll try to be as straightforward and clear as possible. Starting with a current COVID-19 update, with a number of confirmed cases of 249. That's coming from the Ministry of Health and Sports from this morning. So this is fresh out of the website of the Ministry of Health and Sports. We have in Myanmar 165 recovered cases and only 6 deaths. So very low numbers. The testing capacity, you might ask, has improved over the last months. It started very slow, with an average of 350 people per day between mid-April until end of April. But so far, over 43,000 people have been tested in the country. And we were pleased to see an installation of a Swiss, Europe-made test machine installed in the National Health Laboratory of Myanmar. So now the capacity for testing has increased, which is key. Looking at the lockdown and restrictions that were put in place very quickly after the outbreak started. So on 13 March, there was a presidential statement to cancel all public events and close all borders. And these restrictions were extended to 15 May and then 31st May and currently to 15th of June, sorry. However, in late May, we saw a gradual ease of these restrictions, with operations for government offices allowed, companies and factories reopened, public-private schools reopened, and restaurants reopened everywhere in the country with strict instructions from the Ministry of Health and Sports. all international commercial passenger flights are restricted until 15th of June 2020. And we're waiting for an update, probably coming on 14th of June at around midnight. There were quite a significant amount of townships in Yangon where semi-lockdown situations were imposed. 5 of them were lifted since 15th of May. There's still a curfew in Yangon, and that until 18th of June from 10 p.m. to 4 a.m. And I recommend everyone in Yangon to follow that because they're arresting people. Moving on to the government response and the stimulus packages, as well as recovery plans. So there were quite a significant of announcement made by the government since the start of the outbreak. And I'm going to focus now on a recent, well, fairly recent one that was released on 27 April that was very much needed and required by all businesses, which is called the CERP, the Economic Recovery Relief Plan. And as you can see on my slide, it covers quite a lot of sectors, including the banking sector, including a large scope of support to workers, to households, to financial institutions, and to overall private sector. So I'm not going to go into the details of that because you can see on the slide. A big question mark for us was the affordability of all that. And Chris, you asked Malaysia, Sven, how could the government afford all that? And that's a big question mark from Myanmar as well. So the government has announced that 10% of all ministries' budget were cut to reallocate for the CERP. We're evaluating the total amount of this relief plan to around $2 to $3 billion US. So 10% of each ministry's budget will not make the cut. So we're expecting a bit of financial support from international agencies such as the IMF, who has announced a $700 million US support to Myanmar. And the World Bank, so far, $50 million US has been approved, and they're planning a second round of financial support. A bit of an overview, because I'd like to keep it short and maybe give room for questions and from the participants. What we have observed, and this is coming from the IMF and the World Bank, is a revised GDP growth, of course, from around 7% to around 3% from Myanmar, so still positive. I don't think there's a lot of countries in the world that can forecast a positive growth, but still significant decrease. What we're observing as well is that businesses are gradually reopening, schools are reopening, and life is back to an almost normal situation in Yangon. The state councillor, Do Aung San Suu Kyi, has been very involved in the whole process since the beginning. She started live discussions on Facebook with different stakeholders, and this has been very appreciated by the people of Myanmar. The main challenges that we have been facing in Myanmar, the lack of budget and medical equipment, including testing capacities, as I've mentioned. Now, a little bit of what European businesses have felt on the ground. We've conducted a survey end of March with all European investors in Myanmar, and we came up with some interesting outcome. First is the forecasted loss of revenue, which averages between 30 to 50%. We've also identified the main sectors impacted, which are tourism, of course, automotive, garment, FMCG, retail, and manufacturing. These are sectors of priority for the government as well for the recovery phase. And as far as an estimation of recovery time for companies, for European businesses, 51% said that it would take 6 months to recover. To be honest, I think if you ask again now, that period would be much longer. We've come up with a couple of recommendations as well. Some general recommendation, including faster import procedures and customs clearance procedures to support the import-export industries, some subsidies and relief for import and export companies to maintain a strong and steady supply, to provide a corporate tax rebate for the year 2020, and to ensure subsidies to cover for salaries during non-operations. We have also, with the Chamber, come up with a full industry paper that I recommend you to have a look at, and I'd be happy to share the link on the chat right after that. And that's it for me. Thank you, Chris.
Thanks, Mark. Your numbers are very low in Myanmar, and I think early on there was no cases at all being reported, and politicians there were saying it's because we're great and wonderful and live healthy lifestyles. How reliable are the numbers? And I ask this given what I know about the border between Myanmar and China, which is very porous at the best of times. So I think when China was itself going through the highs or the lows, if you like, of COVID-19, there must have been some leakage over the border.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, this is obvious that the number that is announced is not necessarily a reflection of the reality on the ground. Now, if you ask me about the sincerity of the numbers announced by the government, I can assume that it's 100% credible in terms of what their capacity, testing capacities looked like in the last 2 months. So for me, it reflects, the low number reflects more of a lack of testing capacity than an actual number of cases.
Okay. And how is this going to impact on the political situation in Myanmar in terms of how the government's been perceived on the ground to be performing?
That's a good question. As far as we understand, the elections are kept in November this year. Of course, it's a huge. The stakes are huge for the NLD. I'm not gonna lie, and what has been announced and the implication and the commitment of the government so far has been, as I said, very appreciated by the people of Myanmar. So considering the measures taken, the communication strategy of the Myanmar government, I think they've done quite a good job in maintaining that level of communication and engagement with the people. Looking at, of course, having that objective of the elections in November for sure.
Okay, thanks very much indeed. Right, we'll, in the interest of time, we'll move on now to Florian, who's going to cover life for us in the Philippines, where I think they've had one of the more draconian lockdown regimes put in place across the region. So, Florian, please, over to you. I think you need to unmute yourself, Florian.
Okay, here we go. Good afternoon, Chris. Thank you very much for putting this webinar together. And a pleasure to be here. My name is Florian Gotthein, and I'm with the European Chamber of Commerce of the Philippines. I have seen that a lot of participants are actually joining us from the Philippines. So magandang hapon, sanyong lahat, as we say in the Philippines as well. We have prepared a couple of slides. Actually, we have quite a number of slides. I will quickly run through those. We will share it afterwards with you. So if you don't get everything immediately in my presentation, we will be able to provide you with that one. Also in the last slide, you will see my contact details. So if ever you have any further questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. Now, the current COVID-19 situation, if you can just jump to the next slide. Yeah, we have As of yesterday, 4 p.m., basically the DOH, or the Department of Health in the Philippines, announces the latest numbers every day around 4 p.m. in the afternoon. So for June, with June 10, yesterday at 4 p.m., we stand at 23,732 cases, which is quite a high number, specifically compared to the lower numbers we heard from the colleagues in the other countries, Myanmar, Malaysia, etc. We also have to keep in mind that we have the largest population in ASEAN, second only to Indonesia. And I think that puts those numbers again into perspective. We have at the moment about 4,900 recoveries and unfortunately a death toll of 1,027 as of yesterday. We have actually in the Philippines beefed up the testing capacity, which is currently at about 8,000 to 9,000 a day. The contact tracing capacity of the Philippine government has been improving. It still needs further improvement, specifically in Metro Manila. As you can see, it's only 76%. It also is due to the fact that Metro Manila is one of the most densely populated areas worldwide. Metro Manila and its surrounding areas have a population of about 23 million, and the density per square kilometer is quite high, with more than 12,000. So that's why it's also very difficult for the government to trace those cases, and that's also one of the reasons why the Philippines still has this very long lockdown, which is in fact, I think it started on March. It was announced by the president on March 16. It started March 17, and to some extent it's still ongoing. I will highlight this further on in my slides. In the next slide, you basically will see that as of June 1, from this very restrictive regime of an enhanced community quarantine, or ECQ, we love abbreviations in the Philippines. So ECQ stands for Enhanced Community Quarantine, which was from March 17 until late May. We have now transferred into a general community quarantine in metropolitan areas such as Metro Manila, but also Metro Cebu and Zamboanga and Davao City, and other areas where there were quite a number of cases, while the majority of the provinces in the Philippines are now under a so-called MGCQ, or a modified general community quarantine, which is less restrictive than a GCQ. And I will just highlight in my next slides what you're allowed to do in the GCQ versus the MGCQ. I will not now run through each and every detail. I simply would run out of time. But basically, in a nutshell, GCQ is already less restrictive than ECQ, while MGCQ is even less restrictive than GCQ. You can see here what it means. Maybe we can just jump to the next one, which is a bigger issue, which is on transportation. One of the big bottlenecks at the moment in the Philippines, or specifically in the metropolitan areas, are public transport systems, public mass transport system. Many railway, metro, but also then buses are only operating on a limited basis. Social distancing is strictly implemented, and that's why it's also quite difficult for many workers and employees to actually commute from home to their offices. We see that in those areas that are under MGCQ, it's a little bit eased up, it's a little bit less restrictive already. One of the major modes of transport in the Philippines, and for those of you who have been in the Philippines so far, you know that jeepneys, basically the king of the roads, which are used for transporting Filipinos in, I would say, short to medium distances. They are basically built after the famous Willys jeeps from the Second World War, being cut in the middle, being stretched so that about 20 people will fit into it. It's the mean of transportation in many areas of the Philippines, and still not allowed to operate, also causing those issues of people getting stranded or not able to commute. Next slide, please. What does it mean? The current general community quarantine on operations in businesses. Basically, the IATF, or the Interagency Task Force, which was created by the government at the beginning of this pandemic, was categorizing the different sectors. And here you can see on the left side of the slide that categories 1 to 3 are allowed to operate at full capacity. Those are essential sectors: food manufacturing, health-related establishments, e-commerce companies, housing services, and so on and so forth. At the moment, still under this GCQ, there is a category 4, which is fitness, sports facilities, etc., that are still completely restricted to operate. Now, when we jump to the MGCQ, which is other parts of the country outside of Metro Manila and the metropolitan areas, you will see that even this category 4 is allowed to operate, but on a 50% capacity only. Next slide, please. Jumping now to the post-pandemic recovery plans of the Philippine government. I think one of the biggest topics which has kind of haunted us already in the past, previous COVID-19, is the tax reform in the Philippines. The government has come up with a very ambitious tax reform and split it up in several packages. Some of those packages have been passed already, but one of the packages which is also important for businesses, foreign as well as domestic businesses, is what is called now CREATE, or Corporate Recovery and Tax Incentives for Enterprises Act, which was formerly known under TRAIN or CITIRA. Basically, the main point here is to reduce the CIT, or the corporate income tax, from currently 30%, which is among the highest in ASEAN, down to, in the first step, to 25%, and then further on down to 20%, to make the Philippines simply more attractive also for foreign direct investments. Another key element of this CREATE is also the longer sunset transition period for firms currently enjoying special rates at 5% of GIE, and a more flexibility in the grant of incentives for future investors. Aside from that, the government is also looking for additional or alternative sources of revenue, meaning looking which other taxes they could impose. And they are now at the moment studying a digital economy value-added tax, as well as a new health sin tax. Next slide. As I mentioned, the aim of the CIT of CREATE is really to reduce the CIT from currently 30% once it's passed at the onset down to 25%, and then in the next step to 20% latest by 2027. Yeah, I think I mentioned also the digital economy VAT, as well as the health sin tax, as a it's currently being discussed. It was proposed by the National Economic Development Authority, not by the DOF, and it still has to be taken up in the Congress. So I think we are far away from having those new taxes as a burden for enterprises or the consumers in the Philippines. Next slide, please. I mentioned that there will be a longer sunset transition period for firms. Why is it so important? Why I have included this in our presentation? Because it has been one of the major discussion points among our members with the government in the last 2 years, actually. And it also prevented, to some extent, companies from entering the Philippines because of this uncertainty. Is it going to be passed? When is it going to be passed? How will the final version look like? How much taxes do I have to pay as a company then? And what about my promised sunset provisions? Will they really be like that, what was promised at the beginning, or will they be shortened? Now with this updated version, those companies that have been already investors in the country and have been experiencing a GIE regime of more than 10 years, they will still have a transition period into this new regime 4 years. Those, as you can see here in the slide, who have experienced this GIE regime from 5 to 10 years will be granted a transition period of 5 years. Below 5 years, it's going to be 7 years. And those companies who are 100% exporting the products with at least 10,000 employees, and also kind of in footloose projects or sectors, they are being granted even as much as 9 years in this kind of sunset period. Next slide, please. We also have, aside from this tax stimulus package, we also have another package which has been passed in the lower house already and is now waiting basically to be discussed in the upper house in the Senate, which is called Accelerated Recovery and Investment Stimulus for Enterprise Act, or ARISE. Sorry, I missed, for investment stimulus for the economy, ARISE. It's basically a proposed 1.3 trillion pesos accelerated recovery and investment stimulus. Basically, if you can just quickly jump to the next slide, where I've been breaking down the numbers, we will see that 10 billion pesos have been allocated in that stimulus package for mass testing, still ongoing in 2020. 110 billion will be provided for wage subsidy for a period of 2 months, and 42 billion pesos will be allocated for educational subsidies. Next slide, please. The government, or the DOF, actually came up with their very own version of the RISE program, or basically what they call Progreso, or Philippine Program for Recovery with Equity and Solidarity. Basically, we're talking about 1.74 trillion pesos, which is about 9.1% of the Philippine GDP. They were breaking it down to 4 pillars. They would allocate almost 600 billion for emergency support to vulnerable groups, about 60 billion for marshalling resources to fight the COVID-19, 1.1 trillion, or majority of the funds, going to fiscal and monetary measures, and about 850 billion going to sustainable economic recovery plan. Next slide, please. There are a couple of other programs which have been launched, or which have been in discussion by different groups, by different government agencies. As you can see here, maybe one of the more important ones for our small and medium-sized enterprises was a small business wage subsidy, which was a monthly wage subsidy of between 5,000 to 8,000 pesos to eligible employees of small businesses, to bounce off the negative impact of the COVID-19 also on the job situation in the Philippines. But basically, here you can see those smaller programs which have been enacted. Next slide, please. In a nutshell, and to summarize the situation, what's happening in the Philippines, what has been done, what has been effective versus where we still see some room for improvement. I think what really massively helped to improve the situation on the ground in the Philippines is that the private sector has teamed up with the government in various programs. I just put one there. It's called Project ARC. It's private sector initiated. It's basically a program for mass testing in the companies, but also then the companies will donate mass test kits for those municipalities in which they have their premises, to also get a better picture of the infection rate in the Philippines. So basically, you can see here the numbers, what has been achieved. Another maybe point to highlight is also that it was kind of this COVID-19 has been a forced or imposed digital disruption on all of us, including our members. And we really can see now also that companies are innovating, or are forced to innovate, to even transfer more operations into the digital world, which we also see as a positive outcome of this pandemic and this crisis. Where we see still some room for improvement would be actually the sometimes uncoordinated response and inconsistent interpretation of government issuance, specifically on a local government unit level, meaning that local government units in different cities, in different municipalities in the Philippines are not necessarily always aligned with what the national government is saying. That has been causing a lot of bottlenecks, a lot of troubles for our members in the past, just simply when it comes to logistics, transporting the raw materials out of the harbor to their premises, or then also trying to export their finished products produced to other destinations worldwide. So basically, as a chamber, we have been trying to address this, and I really have to say that the Philippine government has been very open to the feedback from the private sector, from the business organizations. We have been in very close touch with them. Even in fact, just earlier today, we had a meeting with several chambers, with the Department of Foreign Affairs Secretary himself, discussing the restrictions on foreign nationals, arrivals of foreign nationals in the Philippines, and what we can do to ease that up, specifically in terms of business travelers, also experts, technicians that are being needed, badly needed in the Philippines to do maintenance, operations, etc., etc. So that's in a nutshell from the Philippines. And in the last slide, you will see our contact details. Please, if you have more questions we can't answer within this limited time in this webinar, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Florian. I've got a couple of very quick questions for you. There are, I think, reports of around 7 million job losses in the Philippines at the moment. What sort of support is the government providing in terms of trying to get those people back to work, or providing some income streams for them?
Well, I think that's a really big concern, Chris. I mean, we are talking about more than 7 million Filipinos that are now actually jobless. So we're talking about the unemployment rate of almost 18%, 17.7%. And I think in the case of the Philippines, we also have to keep in mind that there are many, many OFWs, overseas Filipino workers around the world that have lost their jobs and are being stranded somewhere. So I think that's an additional challenge for the government to also address that. What we as a chamber have been trying to push for is to, even in this ECQ, to look at the ambitious Build program of this Duterte administration to improve the infrastructure, the state of the infrastructure in the Philippines, road, rail, subway, ports, seaports, airports. And we are really pushing that those projects will be again restarted and continued, because I think that way you will create a lot of jobs in the construction sector, not only in Metro Manila but also in other parts of the Philippines, badly needed jobs. On the other hand, tourism industry, transportation industry, airline industry badly hit. We have been in discussion with the Department of Tourism how we as private sector can also help in maybe in the meantime giving webinars, trainings to those staff concerned that have been, under flexible work arrangements, temporary layoff, etc. So that once we are able to restart the economy again, that those people also have upgraded their skills. Another issue in the tourism sector is also thinking about what can be done domestically as a first step to jumpstart the tourism industry again, with Filipinos spending holidays in their own country. And I think there is also a huge potential. We are still working with DOT. I know that they have already come up with an action plan on this. So we see a lot of movement also on that end. But again, I think it will still take a while. We're talking about months, if not years, until we are fully recovered in the Philippines as well. I mean, just to share latest numbers of World Bank, they came out with a report earlier this week. While at the beginning of the year, the Philippines was estimated, or the economy of the Philippines was estimated to grow by 6.1% in 2020, the World Bank has now updated their numbers and is now predicting a decline of about 1.9% in 2020. So we see that this crisis has hit the Philippines badly. But we are all convinced that with the potential of the Philippines, that we will get out of this crisis, and by next year, we will see a strong rebound.
Right, thanks, Florian. Right, I know we're going way over time, so thank you everyone for staying with us. Everyone is staying with us. So we'll move to Singapore now, where I am, and also where where Naila is from Eurocham, Singapore. Naila is still there, yep. Whilst Naila's getting her slides up, I am about to launch a poll for everyone who's attending this. There's a question there about which ASEAN country do you think has handled COVID-19 the best? So the poll is live, so if attendees can vote, that'll be great. Thank you.
I think she's on mute.
Yeah, Naila,
Can you
unmute yourself?
I hope I'll pass through because I have some connection interruptions, but I hope, let me know.
You're okay at the moment.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Yeah, lost your slides though.
I think I was kicked out, but back in. So yeah, can you see my screen?
No.
I need to reshare them.
Yeah, now we have you. Okay.
Okay. Okay. Well, let me know if there is bad connection. I'll try to reconnect and maybe with another device, hopefully. First of all, thank you, Chris, for organizing this. Hello to Asia. Hello to our members here in Singapore. Always happy that they are so loyal and visiting our webinars. Also, good morning to the people in Europe. Okay, if I may, I want to start a little bit with some history. As you all maybe know, Singapore has an image, and it's actually not an image, it's really true. Singapore is a very clean and spotless city. Though there has been in history a battle of numerous infectious diseases in Singapore. No surprise, because actually with a located port, it creates a lot of traffic of people and goods. Also 17 years ago, Singapore was hit by the SARS pandemic, and that actually was already a good lesson. It prepared them on the healthcare front to be well prepared. They created the National Center for Infectious Diseases already then. They increased already then the number of ICU capacity and also their isolation capacities. And then actually in the beginning of the COVID-19 crisis, it was actually due to these precautions that Singapore was able to keep the number relatively down. But today, the total active cases are kind of plateauing. It counts now, and these are the figures from the 9th of June, 38,514 confirmed cases, but only 25 deaths. So I think what I just said proves that Singapore is in control on the healthcare front. They basically have one of the lowest death rates in terms of the people that were contaminated. Only 0.07% of the people. So you see here a picture of a lady, for instance. She's 102 years old, and Singapore very proud to have this lady completely recovered of the COVID-19. A little bit the timeline here. So as we all know, the disease has been spreading in Wuhan since November, but in Singapore, it came to the horizon only in January. And then actually the numbers rose rapidly, also because of, it was right after Chinese New Year. A lot of people had been traveling. In February, the Ministry of Health basically then raised already the disease outbreak response system from level yellow to orange. That meant that there were already implicated precautionary measures, such as encouraging working from home, cancellation of large scale events, and also even a suspension of the school activities. In February, the government announced then their first support budget. The main purpose was then to help the companies immediately with cash flow. For instance, the bars and restaurants were helped with their rental fees, for instance. But meanwhile, the infection continued to go up, and then after, in March, April, and in May, there were 3 more support budgets announced, which brings now the total of Singapore's budgetary support to nearly 100 billion, relevant of 70 billion US dollars, which is equal to 20% of their GDP. That's an enormous amount of money for such a small red dot, but it's worth to say that Singapore is capable of purely fund this by their own reserves, and that makes Singapore resilient also for maybe what comes in the future. So the support from the budget is mainly a cushion for the economy, though the top concern that they have is keeping the jobs. And therefore, they also started some wage subsidiaries, not only for firms, but also even for self-employed people. It is then since April the 7th that we are in a lockdown. Here they call it the circuit breaker. They think it's a bit softer, but in reality it's not. We face also the enclosure of most workplaces except for essential services, and also restrictions on the movement and gathering of people. So after that, the pandemic seemed to pass over the city-state, but then in April, the government was actually blindsided by an outbreak among migrant workers packed in dormitories. So right then, after that, even more a strict lockdown was enforced, and all schools, most businesses are closed, masks are mandatory, shopping is permitted only for absolute necessities like food and medicine. And that's a little bit where we are still today. Though the numbers are declining, plateauing, so the government is confident that the situation is under control. And we are basically now already in phase 1 of a new deconfinement plan, consists of 3 phases. So that the plan, actually the first phase would start the 2nd of June. That is what's so far have been announced. So this is basically the communication of the government to the broad public. And if you are a fast reader, you actually can see that there is nothing on reopening of the borders, nothing set on traveling. And that's exactly where the concern is from our members, European companies here in Singapore. Singapore is a regional hub. Our companies are operating their businesses in the region out of Singapore, and it's a huge stake if they cannot travel. So there is at this moment not really a perspective. EUROCHAM has also taken his responsibility there. So yes, we have done joint communications with the national business chambers towards the Ministry of Trade and Industry and other ministries. So they are aware of the concern that we have. So what is the economic outlook? I think a bit like we've heard so far today, a bit concerning, of course. Singapore in particular, we depend heavily on international trade and investments. And these were already slowing down even before the COVID-19. And so now they expect the slowdown will be even faster and even go further. DBS Bank was giving some figures, a forecast of the economy with the contract by 5 to 7%. And that's also kind of what the government have been communicating. So a little bit of snapshots. Well, what are the concerns of Singapore? First of all, government wants to save jobs, jobs, jobs. Especially for the local people, they expect still, even with all the support that they give, job losses to be increased with numbers between 150,000 up to 200,000 this year. Also some concerns on specific sectors. We heard them already today from the other countries, similar here in Singapore. F&B, travel, hospitality, and retail sectors are obviously, not only in Singapore, but globally heavily hit. But also here in Singapore, the manufacturing sector, because we depend much on the industrial production of China here in this case. So, and that have been, the supply chain shock, as we all know, have been a reality. The proud of Singapore, Singapore Airlines, yes, has also been hit, very first ever loss in 48 years. The weakness of the airline in that sense is that it must operate from Singapore, which is a small city-state, so they don't have a lot of cushion with the coverage in other countries. So we'll see how that will develop further. Okay, let's move to a bit the positive sides, because despite of all these challenges, Singapore has some strengths. Singapore has faith in his economic strengths. Like I mentioned before, all the support, basically, they never have to dig into their fundings. It all comes from their past reserves. And on top of that, they still can count on a very good international reputation. So with these two strengths, I think Singapore will see the next maybe 2 years rough times, but they will prevail. They are pretty realistic. We had a speech from Prime Minister Lee last Sunday. I have to say his speech was not blooming things. It was very realistic. And I think that's also a good thing, that the country and the government is very open, says where it is, what the concerns are, but also gives some perspectives. And I think it's right there where we need to be, the future economy strategies. So Singapore believes, okay, now is the time to change our economy, and therefore we need to upgrade our workers. They call it Skills Future. They have a lot of brainstorming cells for that, to support that. Number two, they will invest in digitalization for both private and public sector. And number three, they will invest more in innovation and R&D capabilities. They will also help companies to make the switch, to reform their business, to reform their business models, to go digital, or to completely switch to other fields or industries. In terms of transport, Singapore is a hub, obviously, so transport and trade links is important. Currently, the ministries have told us that they are soon to be announced their concrete plans. So the homework is done. So far we know that, for instance, Changi is heavily working to be able soon to facilitate safe traveling between the green lanes arrangements. And then the fourth precaution that Singapore is preparing for is to be more resilient in supply chain, so to reduce the risk of the supply chain shocks. So at this moment, they're kind of looking for creative solutions, diversifying their sources of food. I know, for instance, that just recently they start buying eggs from Poland. So that's also good for Europe. Okay, thank you so much.
Thanks.
That's what I wanted to share with you.
Thanks, Nayla. You mentioned a few things there. I mean, Singapore, as you said, is very much a trading country. It relies on international connections, and it's what was a world-renowned connectivity, not just aviation and shipping, but of course in ICT and its banking centres as well. How much has this circuit breaker lockdown and the closure of borders, and in particular the impact on the aviation industry, hurt Singapore's competitiveness?
Well, that's a very good question. And like I said, the good thing is that the government is pretty realistic. So last Sunday, the Prime Minister Lee said, okay, going for a quick trip, a weekend to Bangkok, it won't happen in the next months, maybe the next 2 years. So they do understand that they will be hit hard, but when you do understand that as a country, I think they are equally ready and keen to be prepared, to be prepared to do the transformation of the economy. And yes, Singapore is a hub. It's highly connected to global flows of trade, of investment, of capital and people. International trade and investment will shrink, but they will not disappear entirely. So some flows will dry up, but others, new channels, will open up. So there will be still opportunities for international partnerships. Singapore is actually always very well placed to facilitate these channels and flows, and in that way create new business with a global focus. Their idea of investing in digitalization also will help them to find opportunities on a more global scale, all then basically virtually like we do today, basically. In terms of the borders, like I said before, so Singapore is currently working hard, having the dialogues with other countries to start the green lanes, to find the criteria, the arrangements for safe traveling. They already announced to have that in place with certain provinces in China. I expect soon that the government will be transparent in the further list of countries, maybe Vietnam, maybe Malaysia. So yeah, I think overall the benefit of Singapore is it's a government that is well prepared, have been in the past and will be in the future as well.
Okay, you mentioned that the green lane with China, and the requirements of that actually are extremely onerous. When you come back, you still need to serve a stay-at-home notice. And overall, I think the feeling early on, Singapore was handling the whole crisis very, very well, and then dropped the ball with the workers' dormitories. But in terms of support for business, they've done a great job, and it's all pretty much automated. What's your overall assessment? If you had to give them a scorecard for their overall handling so far, out of 10, with 10 being excellent, where would you put them?
Well, I think overall for businesses, the monetary support has been there. Definitely for local businesses, for local workers, overall, I think we must be lucky that we are here in Singapore. It's a different story for foreign workers. members, including us, Europeans. So, like I said, government is investing in keeping the jobs, but mainly for the locals. So we here with Europeans working for big European companies, it's a risk when we understand that employment passes are at risk not to be renewed, that people with employment passes are stranded abroad. We cannot enter back in Singapore. So those are concerns that we, in our field, amongst our community, have been heavily raised. Yeah.
All right, thank you very much. And finally, we will head to Thailand, to one of my favorite cities, Bangkok, and to Kun Tranya. Thank you.
Just 1 second. Yes. Hi. For Thailand, current COVID-19 situation, as you can see, the total cases we have is 3,125. And also in the number of cases, we have more than 400,000. We also have currently 80 active cases, 58 dead, and more than 2,987 recover. In terms of the current lockdown and restriction, Thailand is still in the state of emergency until the end of June. We also have a curfew hours from 11 p.m. to 3 a.m. Inbound flight is still banned until the end of June. And in terms of visa entry measures, all visa classes are extended to the end of July except work permit. So at the moment, work permit holders, mass visa, and Thai citizens are allowed to enter to Thailand, and they must have the insurance minimum coverage for coronavirus for $100,000 US, and they must go to the state of quarantine system. Business reopening is coordinated by the public-private group and is prioritized by risk category. So very low risk to low risk businesses were first to open, and then the high risk businesses will be the last one. However, they must comply with the health requirement and social distancing. In Thailand, we also use the QR code, which is called Thai Chana, for the people who enter to any business establishment. Economic stimulus package. So the House of Representatives approved the support funding for 1.9 trillion baht, and it will go to the three main budget, which is one is for remedy and economic stimulus purposes. Second, it will go to provide soft loan for SME, and the third budget will go to financial stabilization. I'm not going to talk in the detail, so I will send you my presentation slide later. And they also have another economic package scheme, basically from the Social Security Fund. 5,000 baht will be given to the people who self-employed and also who are freelance or losing their jobs if they are due to the forced shutdown of business. Also, the Board of Investment Thailand also supporting by using the e-submission extend the application deadline. Also, we provide some loans such as emergency loans, special loans, and the soft loans for SME. So the main question is, what will we do after all the support measures are over? Economic survey impact from this situation, and there is a lot of money to repay it. At the moment, there is no long-term coordinated economic plan yet, but there is a recognition of the need of it, and some of the changes need to be permanently. So we would like to see in the big picture, in the macro level, how we can continue to do businesses. However, we can see some digital development, especially in the electronic meeting and the e-payment. And also we also spot some negativity, a room of improvement, especially in the visa and work permit issue or online education. In overall, Thailand, I can say that has a strong medical care, but number of the testing is still very low. The public-private groups determines which premises to reopen, which is differ from another economic, which is depend on the government decision. We can see some electronic meeting rule had changed and some lack of clarity about tracing apps. And then, for example, it's trend towards premises-based entry tools with QR code called Thai Chana over proximity apps such as Mo Chana. And although we have many funding support, but there is no specifically focusing on keeping jobs in the company. And we also spot some lack of digitalization in the common process, and also some gap in the SME financial support that tend to be cautious. So that's the end of my presentation. So you can see the overall COVID situation in Thailand. And as an EABC, we also update regularly on our website under the business continue. And also we run a survey on this topic as well. So for more information, you can check from our website.
Thanks very much there. That was a very good overview. I'm just wondering, in terms of the support packages for the country, is there anything in particular that's being aimed at job retention, and particularly perhaps in the tourism industry, which is so important to Thailand?
At the moment, there is no specific, it has been under concern, recognition about the changing, because of course the tourism industry has the most affecting on this one, but it's still, current support is still not enough. Like Social Security Fund is supporting only the people who lose their job during a lockdown, but there's no something about keeping job in the businesses. So it's still, we're still working on it, and hopefully we have launching something, something that you can see in the bigger picture.
Okay. And in terms of reopening up, I know the processes have begun already in Thailand. I see it every night on TV, a gradual reopening. But perhaps when will, do you think, international flights be allowed again, and we can start looking forward to getting back into Thailand?
Hopefully, it should end by the end of the month. Actually, tomorrow there's going to be a meeting leading by Prime Minister, and talking is going to be the topic discussed about the phase 4 lockdown relaxation. But in terms of the flight, yeah, I don't think it's going to be that long anymore, because the case of the COVID-19 in Thailand is relatively small now, and we haven't seen any more deaths in terms of domestic cases for the last 16 days. So I think we can see a positivity that we're going to open the border and allow people to come to Thailand, because at the moment it's only allowed for the Thai citizen, like repatriation flight mainly for now, but hopefully they will open up more border very soon.
A final one for you. I think Thailand was the only country in the region to bring in prohibition as part of its COVID-19 response. So when can people look forward to getting a beer again?
Actually, it's gonna be, this topic gonna be discussed in a tomorrow meeting, as I mentioned. So one of them is about relaxation of the education, and also in terms of alcohol. But I don't think that they're gonna open some bars and the pubs like that. But in terms of selling alcohol in general, yeah, there will definitely be, but this is not officially yet, but it's a topic to be discussed tomorrow, and hopefully we can see the outcome very soon.
Okay. Thank you very much. I asked a poll earlier about which country in the region has handled the crisis best. I can tell you But Vietnam came out top, and unfortunately they're not on this call, but Vietnam came out top with 39% of the votes. And unfortunately, Indonesia, Edison, you're right at the bottom with only 1% of the votes on that poll. Very quickly, as we're coming in, and we've indeed gone way over time, perhaps I'll just ask you all, where do you think this ends? So when do you think I, for instance, will be able to get on a plane and come and visit you, and we can start getting back to something resembling normality? So I'll ask you to give you those answers, please, very briefly. We'll start with Blaise in Cambodia. If you can unmute yourself, Blaise.
Please come again. I was looking at the poll just now.
Sorry, yeah. When do you think we're going to come out of all of this and we can perhaps get back to some degree of normalcy?
I mean, again, because we are so, depending on international integration, and because to have domestic capacities, replace what is brought by tourism and foreign direct investment, I don't think we will be out of this this year. I mean, we look at education. I was answering a question just now, nothing is planned before November. Tourism was hoping to get 40% of the high season, which starts in November. Now those hopes are being, downgraded due to the current measures being taken. Demand in the US and the EU, we don't know when it's going to pick up. So I think the question is more, are these hopes for a V-shaped recovery credible or not? I think that's the real question to be asked. So I think this year for sure is going to be negative. How much of a real recovery we can hope for next year is a real question. But unfortunately, as time goes by, we always see those forecasts being reduced again and again and again and again. So I don't think anything good would happen before 2021, to be honest. Now, yes, there may be, enough to survive in 2020 for businesses who are about to die of asphyxia, 1 month ago. But to hope for, a rising sun and new hopes, I think it's a bit early.
Thanks, Blaise. You're an optimist. Edison, can you fill me with some joy with your perspective? Okay.
I share the same sentiment with Blaise, but I think when will this end is when we find a cure for this COVID-19 virus. And the fact is, I think every country in this world is fed up with this lockdown and pandemic situation. And the good thing is that to survive this new normal requires basically, I always say this, 3 things. The ability to adapt, the ability to adjust, and to cooperate. And what I've seen most recently is that a lot of countries and pharmaceutical companies are joining hands, joining efforts to speed up a search for a common cure for this. In Indonesia itself, out in the news today, local pharmaceutical companies are trying to develop herbal means to serve as an alternative cure for this. And European companies are also stepping up efforts to find a common cure for this. So until we find a common cure, we have to adjust and adapt to the new normal. That's how I see it. In the new normal, we still have to work, we still have to trade, we still have to meet people. But of course, definitely we have to practice social distancing and washing hands and wearing a mask like this everywhere we go. So definitely that's just going to be a part of life for this year.
Yeah, I'm afraid I think you're probably right. Sven, if I could just throw one quick question at you. Prospects for reopening the border between Singapore and Malaysia?
Well, as you know, Chris, there are a lot of discussions going on, and potentially we see something like a green land coming up there. I think eventually it will happen because we're now already in very close communication with the Immigration Department, the National Security Council, and others to let certain expats in. That was a very big issue which we basically got the confirmation from the Prime Minister just this week. So it looks like that will be happening. Certainly we have teething problems. As usual, the authorities fail to implement properly, but I'm sure we get or we find ways to deal with that. And I think the border with Singapore was actually a second topic which we also raised there together with our American friends and also the Japanese. So I'm quite sure that we actually will make some inroads there. And Singapore was also kind of interested to move on this. I think the problem was more on the Singaporean side, if I remember it correctly. So I hope that this message is kind of has reached and that we see this very soon coming up as another positive move towards opening and revitalizing the economy.
All right, thanks, Sven. If any of you got any positive notes we could end on, any rays of sunshine coming through the dark clouds across the region? I see Florian smirking.
Chris,
well, I think there are opportunities for. Oh, sorry, Florian, go ahead.
I think it was Mark.
It was Mark, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, no, not necessarily some optimism or light, but just to come back to your question, Chris, for Myanmar as it stands, and I didn't share that information in my presentation, but so the border is still closed until 15th of June. We're expecting this to be extended to the end of the month. But as it stands, the conditions for returning to Myanmar are a week of home quarantine before taking off, before flying. Upon arrival, you have to show a lab test showing negative results for COVID-19, and then another week of quarantine in a public health facility. So to answer your question, we're all hoping to be back to normal very soon, and to be able to come back to Myanmar. Now the big question mark is under which conditions, and as it stands, it seems quite complex for most foreigners to come back to Myanmar.
Okay.
And I'm sorry, that was not a shine light.
Perhaps Naila's got a ray of sunshine for me. Naila?
Yeah, I do believe there are opportunities, definitely for European companies. We are strong in innovation. It is basically in our DNA. We know how to transform. We did it in the past. We know how to digitalize our businesses. And I think that's where the opportunities are, even for European companies. And if we do it all together here in Asia, if we collaborate in that, I think that should be the positive note. New worlds, new opportunities.
Thank you. There were some questions on the Q&A from people about the level of cooperation in ASEAN. Are ASEAN countries working together on dealing with the crisis, or indeed on post-pandemic economic recovery? I can tell you it is not a very good picture from ASEAN as a collective at the moment. They do have a joint consultative committee on COVID-19 response, which is mainly being led by health ministers, where it's essentially sharing information and some sharing of equipment and tests going on. The economic ministers met last week to discuss post-pandemic recovery. They are being pushed hard by the ASEAN Business Advisory Council and all the joint business councils, including ourselves, to do something more coordinated across the region to help it come out. And that includes on travel. And at the moment, I can tell you there are no discussions going on at an ASEAN level about reopening across the region, which is extremely disappointing. But let's hope we can do that. I'd like to thank you all for the time. Thank all our attendees for being patient with us and hanging on with us throughout. We ran a long over time, but I think you'll all agree it was extremely useful. Some great information there from my colleagues across the region. And I thank each of you for taking the time to do this. And we may well repeat it again in the future, perhaps with better news and increased GDP and reopened borders and a big celebration. Thank you, everybody, joining us. Keep safe, keep well. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye. Cheers.